There's nothing worse than a sequel being not as good as the original, getting so many unforgettable hours out of a goated game, only to be met with an inferior version of the product is a pain that rarely goes away. But one fanbase in particular that felt this sting of disappointment was the Dying Light community, with the release of Dying Light 2.
You know, this game used to be more fun!
This sequel was 7 years in the making. After the success of the original game completely taking everyone and the industry by surprise, Dying Light is loved by fans for its unique elements. Parkour mixed in with zombie killing is a match made in heaven, and though the story was nothing to write home about, the voice acting helped keep you engaged, and the following helped elevate the narrative and evolve the gameplay even further. Dying Light and its expansion were good enough to sell people on this franchise for years to come, and when the trailer dropped for the long-awaited sequel, fans couldn't be any more excited, and then it got delayed. Though this was disappointing, fans kept up hope, praying for the day it would come out, and then it got delayed again, finally releasing in early 2022, and it was met with mixed emotions to say the least. Why did people feel this way about Dying Light 2? So much good stuff was promised about the game that it seemed impossible for the devs to fail. Well, that's just it. Dying Light 2 was completely overpromised to the fans. Now, the game has been out for a few years at this point, and so Techland have managed to fix many of the issues that plagued the early version of the game. That being said, you can't completely overhaul a game's DNA with a few bug fixes and adding some new content. On paper, Dying Light 2 seems like it should be better than the first game. It has a more in-depth narrative, it offers you more forms of combat, parkouring has a lot more flourishes to it, the music is once again straight fire, and yet for many people, one is still better, and I'd have to agree. There was once a time when I loved Dying Light 2, and to be fair, I still have a certain level of affection towards it. It reminds me of being at uni, staying up late and ignoring assignments, emailing my lecturers telling them I was ill, when in actual fact I was just looking for my next hit of shiny rocks and dirty needles. Now 3 years later, the cracks I couldn't see before are now much easier to spot, and I'm a little bit embarrassed looking back at it because this game has its issues. Words like tedious, boring, confusing, and cringe spring to mind when thinking about Dying Light 2, and it was hard to convince myself to continue playing the game at times when Dying Light 1 is right there. It also seemed like Techland couldn't get the first game out of their heads either.
You fight them for the last ray of dying light.
Perhaps they were just trying to remind themselves of what a great game actually looks like, before they completely lost themselves in the Dying Light 2 source. It's a shame because this game had the potential to be so much more than it was, and to be fair, it's not the worst game out there, but when most people agree the first game is better, you know something's not right. This video aims to cover all the things that went wrong with Dying Light 2, starting with the most disappointing part of the game. Dying Light 2 took a more personal approach with its story. While Dying Light's story followed Crane's antics helping Haran and eventually dooming humanity, the second game's story focuses on Aiden's journey to find his long-lost sister, who he hasn't seen for about 15 years. A lot has happened since the following's ending. The outside world found a cure for the Haran virus, but unfortunately, like the cliched villainous company they are, the GRE manufactured a new strain that quickly escaped the lab it was made in, and wiped out 98% of the human population in less than 2 years, leading to this event in history being labelled as the Fall. With very few humans being left alive and most of the world being covered in infected, only a select few of individuals have the ability and know-how to traverse the monster-infested wasteland that was once Earth. These people are labelled pilgrims. These guys act as couriers and are responsible for long-distance communication between settlements, kind of becoming the new world's version of Amazon and WhatsApp at the same time. Aiden is one of these pilgrims, but rather than get a career in next-day delivery, he's looking for his sister Mia, and after finding out new information on her potential whereabouts, he tracks her to Old Villador, thanks to the help of a guy called Dylan and another pilgrim, our old boy Spike. Well, it's nice to see at least some people made it out of Haran.
I wish Crane could have seen this.
Who?
Doesn't matter.
Don't worry Spike, I'm sure Crane is doing well with all his freaky new powers. Aiden goes to meet Dylan outside of Old Villador, but is attacked and infected by a volatile. Dylan comes to Aiden's rescue and tells him about a man named Waltz. Get used to that name because it crops up a lot.
What?
Waltz is a shady bastard from Aiden's past, and is his ticket to finding Mia, but Dylan tells Aiden to escape with a special key that will come in handy later. Waltz kills Dylan with the help of his growly renegades.
There's our lost lamb, and he's not alone. We can fix that. Slaughter him.
Who greenlit that voice acting? Aiden escapes the sewers and reaches Old Villador, the so-called last bastion of humanity, and this is where his story begins. Well, that's not entirely true, as Aiden's story is put on the back burner for most of the game, while he helps everyone else with their problems, with each of them promising and failing to help him look for his sister. Right off the bat, one of the biggest gripes for me is the fact that for the most part, the story feels like it's going nowhere. Every couple of hours you're getting introduced to a whole bunch of new characters and settlements, learning about their struggles, with Aiden eventually helping them, and finishing off with them bottling helping you. The introduction with Hakon is a pretty solid start to the story. After nearly getting hung by some survivors, a charismatic fella called Hakon comes to your rescue. Apparently everyone in the city is pretty much infected, so you need a biomarker to show when you're going to turn. Antizin isn't really a thing these days. This new strain only takes effect when an individual isn't in direct sunlight or under a UV lamp. Hakon explains that he saved Aiden because he knows he's a pilgrim and wants to escape the city with him when Aiden decides to leave. They form quite a wholesome partnership during the first few chapters of the story, which is a rare occurrence as most of the NPCs are unlikable arseholes. I made fun of many of the characters in the first Dying Light because they were either really stupid, unintentionally funny, or just a bit boring, but I would happily spend a day with any of them than a single minute with most of these dickheads. Like the first game, the map is split into two main areas: Old Villador, which is pretty much the outskirts of the city, and the centre, which is where most of the action takes place. Unfortunately for Aiden and Hakon, they can't just waltz into the centre, as the passages have been blocked off by a faction of survivors trying to find the person who murdered their commander. Dying Light 2's world contains a whole load of factions and groups, all with their own motives, and all just as violent as the last. Peacekeepers are the enforcers of Old Villador. After the government collapsed and everything went to shit, the PKs rose in their place to help retain some form of law and order. These are the guys who have blocked up the entrances to the centre, and after speaking with Aitor, a very important PK, he tells Aiden to help him find the killer, who he suspects is from the Bazaar. The Bazaar refers to a specific group of survivors who live in the church in Old Villador, and these guys are the second group of individuals Aiden does work for. Survivors is just a generic term for anyone who isn't a PK or a renegade psycho. The main enemy faction of the game are the renegades. These guys are all for murder, torture, and sounding like goblins.
Thanks for the help, PK Dog. Now, be a good boy. Get lost.
The renegades are probably the least important and interesting, just because they're the generic bad guy faction. The other two factions are utilised a lot more, both in the story and in terms of gameplay. Without going into the gameplay too much just yet, depending on your choices, you can earn benefits from both the PKs and the survivors. The Bazaar folk have manufactured a war with the PKs because they don't believe in the ideals of a fascist rule. They don't want a caged Villador, but a free one, and one that apparently encourages hanging and the murder of anyone who opposes them. It's up to the player who you want to side with, but Techland are constantly implying that the PKs are the baddies, and the Bazaar folk are the side you should be rooting for and trying to help. While that's not so far-fetched, I can get behind some survivors in need. Well, you see, the problem is that most of the survivors are really hateable. Everyone is so snarky and condescending, and that especially goes for the two leaders, Sophie and her brother Barney. Christ, sorry, I can't say his name without throwing up a little. For some reason, the people of the Bazaar think that these two are the best choice for their leaders. Essentially, they don't like being told what to do, and their inclusion in the game makes it very hard to want to side with the survivors. Sophie constantly talks down to you like she's some high and mighty person, and one of the very first interactions you have with Barney has him use his dying friend as a distraction to trick Aiden, leaving both Aiden and his dying friend for dead. As if being really unlikable arseholes wasn't bad enough, after learning Aiden is working for the PKs as well, instead of talking to him about it, they straight up try to kill him. I'm supposed to believe the PKs are the villains of the story, when all I've seen from them so far is them helping people and actually keep their promises to Aiden.
Are we the baddies?
Even later on when you get to the centre, most of the PKs are just sound geezers. Well, apart from one, but I've got a segment just for him. Now, there's nothing wrong with having unlikable characters, but when you make the supposed good guys of Villador some of the worst characters in the game, then surely that's a red flag. Honestly, if it weren't for Alberto and Vincenzo, I would have fully committed to the PKs. You two got lucky. Having a story with multiple choices sounds great on paper. Giving Dying Light an RPG-esque narrative could have been great, and offered up a whole bunch of interesting plot threads. Unfortunately, this concept is nothing like what was showcased at all of those E3 demos. Apart from a few rare instances, your choices make very little impact to the game. In my playthrough, I chose to help the Bazaar and blow up the PK windmill. In most games, an event like this would have lasting consequences throughout its duration, but in Dying Light 2, it's instantly shrugged off the minute you enter the centre. What's even worse is that the game itself makes it seem like there's going to be consequences for it. Several of the PKs mention that whoever blew up the windmill will pay, but Aitor goes from having a grudge against Aiden to immediately forgetting about it. Now, this may sound good, you know, finally in this game full of dickheads and ungrateful crybabies, someone actually doesn't want you dead, but it would make more sense for Aitor to hate Aiden at this point in the game, considering he did blow up a giant windmill, but Aitor just shrugs it off. There's even a mission where you have a choice to save Aitor or let him die. The game implies that with Aitor alive, the PKs can find out what happened in Old Villador, but if you let him die, then that secret dies with Aitor. I ended up saving Aitor because I felt bad for the guy, having to deal with her all day. Jesus, no wonder he's dying. And what happened after this? Was Aiden put on trial for his crimes? Maybe a bounty got put on his head? No, it's even worse than that, I'm afraid. Aitor forgives him and gives you his dead commander's weapon. Yikes, chill out Aitor, you savage. Dying Light 2 feels like it brushes off many of its earlier plot threads in favour of new ones when you reach the centre. The only one that it carries on with, and arguably is the strongest one, is Hakon. Despite Sophie and Barney being complete twats, it's revealed that they weren't the ones who killed Lucas, despite finding his skin in Sophie's private stash. The real killer turns out to be Hakon. According to Hakon, Waltz ordered him to kill Lucas to spark a war between the survivors and the PKs. Why? No clue, the game doesn't tell you, but this puts Aiden in a tough spot when given the choice to save Hakon after being shot with an arrow by an unknown assailant. This turns out to be one of the only game-defining choices in Dying Light 2, as it affects two possible endings for the game. I chose to save Hakon. Despite him technically betraying Aiden in a way by working with his greatest enemy, he's still a good lad deep down, trust me. The game has many instances where Aiden can decide what to do, and yet this choice feels like the only one that has real consequences behind it. Sure, there are choices that can lead to the death of certain characters, but everything that has meaning in the game stems from this interaction with Hakon alone. It's almost like an illusion of choice, which feels like a waste, especially when you consider how in-depth the narrative choices were originally envisioned, and this idea of helping PKs and survivors bleeds into the gameplay too. Territory plays a role in Dying Light 2, whereas Rice only really had his headquarters. PKs and survivors can gain control of certain structures, like water towers, windmills, and power stations. Once Aiden has finished clearing out a place of infected, or turns the power back on, he can give it to either the PKs or survivors, with each faction offering up different abilities. PKs give you access to more combat-oriented upgrades, like car traps and mountable turrets, whereas survivors give Aiden access to things that make parkouring a little easier. Once again, it feels like Techland is trying to discourage you from helping the PKs too much.
So you did it?
Are you pissed at me?
Nah, your choice. And I know why. But if it were me, I'm for the free folk all the way.
Okay, fine, I'll help the survivors next time. Wow, inflatables. They're loads better than having a turret or a car trap. Thanks, guys. Although Dying Light 2's gameplay feels similar to the first Dying Light's gameplay, there are several changes that make the two feel like polar opposites in certain ways. Many people refer to Dying Light as a zombie game with parkour in it, and I would argue that Dying Light 2 is a parkour game with zombies and psychopathic survivors in it. A lot of focus has been put on the player's ability to traverse around the city of Old Villador in a variety of different ways. Much like in the first game, the first area available to you isn't too hard for the player to get used to. Buildings are fairly low to the ground, giving you plenty of room for error. Then the second area, as expected, gives the player access to higher up areas, but hazardous drops as a payoff. The parkour is definitely the strongest aspect of Dying Light 2, and it's one of the aspects you can see Techland put a lot of effort into making enjoyable. As the game goes on, you are able to progress and earn more skills, allowing you to parkour for longer and tackle obstacles in different ways. Dying Light 2 offers up many challenges for the player to complete that utilise parkour. Though the first Dying Light gave the player specific parkour challenges, Dying Light 2 allows the player to activate safe zones, windmills, power stations, and water towers by using the parkour skills you have learned. Running and jumping can only get you so far though, which is why the game rewards Aiden with equipment that helps him travel around Old Villador easier. The power glider is the answer to the large gaps between buildings, and gives you an extra backup plan if you get caught at night. Well, that's if you don't get shot down. Aiden can also find a grapple hook, and while it's not as quick and snappy as the one Crane had, it's arguably a lot more reliable, as rather than having to wait for it to recharge after 2 consecutive uses, it goes off Aiden's stamina, allowing you to use it more often. The emphasis on parkour is great, but I do miss getting around on the buggy. Hopefully it managed to escape the countryside in time. On a side note, before I get into the utter dullness of the rest of the gameplay, the soundtrack of Dying Light 2 is so good. Whereas the first game's music was almost dystopian, portraying the events of the game in a depressing light, Dying Light 2's music emphasises hope. Despite everything bad happening in the world, Haran, the fall, Barney being born, humanity has still managed to find a way to survive these terrible historic moments, and almost every track pushes this emotion onto the player. Many of them push you when you're parkouring as well. Whenever one of these tracks starts to play, it flips a switch in my simple chimp brain that makes me want to carry on running or climbing higher and higher until I reach my objective. The songs that are meant to evoke other emotions actually do this too, whether that's to evoke fear when in a dark zone or when the goat is talking. In fact, the music is what carries many of these cutscenes, because they really aren't carried by their voice performances.
Aren't you the pilgrim they wanted to hang?
It's a shame that the rest of the gameplay is very dull and repetitive. The combat alone is enough to either send you to sleep or send you into a blind rage. Enemies, no matter if they're infected, human, big or small, they all tank so much damage. Even enemies that are the same level as you at that current time hate to die. There's no shame in hating the idea of dying. I do too, but you wouldn't think that from the amount of times I fell from a high place. But there comes a point where enemies just need to chill out. Even when using the stomp skill, one of the most trustworthy skills in the first game, doesn't always completely kill an enemy. In fact, finishers were only officially added into the game in late 2023, so Techland made the game thinking that having spongy enemies enemies no matter what level you are was a good idea. Stuff like this takes a lot of the satisfaction away from the combat. In the original game, getting a slow-mo kill on a viral or taking down thugs in a few hits really felt rewarding, as it showed the player was learning and adapting to the enemy behaviour. And even now with the block mechanic that stuns enemies, you can't even insta-kill them until they're out of stamina. Plus it takes me right out of the experience when enemies don't die to multiple swings from an electrified slab of metal, but instantly buckle after a few shitty throwing knives. This highlights many other issues with the gameplay that really can't be ignored. It feels like Techland wanted to take Dying Light 2 in a different direction than the first game, and in turn made it feel a lot more generic. If it isn't broke, don't fix it. Obviously the team at Techland forgot about this mantra and decided to mix it up a bit with some of Dying Light's mechanics. It's the smaller details that make the first game feel so smooth. A game with such an emphasis on movement needs mechanics that keep you in the moment, and Dying Light 2 introduces things that makes the basics more tedious for no reason. Healing in the first game was quick, effective, and allowed you to remain in the fight. Healing in Dying Light 2 may as well be a death sentence. It takes forever, leaving you open to attacks, which adds to the already infuriating combat. The system was made overcomplicated by all the different ways you can heal yourself, as inhalers and army medkits are the only good forms of healing, which are like gold dust most of the time. Even upgrading normal medkits doesn't decrease the time it takes to use them. Repairing weapons was a necessary feature in the first game, as it encouraged you to use a variety of weapons to avoid breaking them. A plus side though was that you could repair your weapons on the go, quickly fixing them and then getting back into the fight. In Dying Light 2, if your weapons break, you have to take it all the way to a craft master, who will charge you gold to repair it. In a game that's all about running and fighting, making you have to go out of your way to get a weapon fixed feels counterintuitive. Sorry lads, I know we're in the middle of a fight, I've just got to go and fix my weapon real quick. Another fun feature about Dying Light was passive kills. Crane could utilise the environment to kill zombies, and the game would reward you with XP. While the same traps make a return in Dying Light 2, you gain no XP when using them. Despite these tools being there, it's like the game doesn't want you to use them. It would rather you just mindlessly hack and slash for 30 hours. 29 of those hours are dedicated to hitting renegades, with the other 1 hour having you fight infected. With a game that has such an impressive roster of special infected, it's crazy how you rarely ever see them, and instead have to fight these snarling freaks every 5 minutes. Not to mention that they do the same shit over and over again, making each encounter blend into the last. The only silver lining is that they've got a banging theme tune. Even when you get the chance to fight infected, you wish you'd never bothered, because it's just as tedious as the renegade wankers. In the first game, virals only came after you when you made a loud noise, like if you shot a gun or blew up a gas tank. This made sense as they were attracted to noise, and it added that little bit of difficulty during the daytime. In Dying Light 2, however, they've all turned into Daredevil. Just the mere act of hitting an infected will cause virals to come rushing at you from every dark crevice imaginable. Add to the fact that there's rarely ever an insta-kill potential, and you start to wonder why you bothered fighting in the first place. It makes fighting infected completely unenjoyable, and more hassle than it needs to be. What's even more annoying is that NPCs can make all the noise they want. They can yell, hit infected, and sound those really annoying horns, and get off scot-free. But Aiden so much as farts and it's over. This was done because for a long time, guns weren't in the game. That was the trade-off in the first Dying Light. Yeah, you've got an overpowered gun, but the more you use it, the more the virals will come after you. For the longest time, guns weren't in Dying Light 2, so Techland needed an excuse for virals to come after you when in combat. The thing is, guns are in the game now. A top bloke called Jay tells you how to get them, so Techland really could have changed the mechanic to how it was in the first game, and yet you still get punished for fighting zombies. And besides, there are screamers all over the map anyway, and they are just itching to grass you up to the virals. I always thought a good trade-off would have been to have virals come out when you fail a jump and hit the ground hard. It makes sense because it makes a loud ass sound and encourages you not to be careless when parkouring. The progression system feels like a complete chore this time around too. Everything feels too grindy, and since combat lacks any real substance, leveling Aiden up just doesn't hit as good as it did in the first game. This has a chain reaction throughout other gameplay aspects too, as it makes going out and doing night activities feel much less beneficial in this game. Leveling up takes so much longer, which just makes your progression through the game seem minimal, and even when you do something that's hard and that's supposed to be rewarding, you just feel numb. This is thanks to a multitude of different reasons. Progression sucks, enemies don't die, quests are boring as they just boil down to the same shit, and the story continues to be boring as well. Apart from Aiden and Hakon, another major character in the game is Lawan. She is the ex of Hakon and wants him dead for reasons that are unknown to Aiden at the time. She's actually the one who shoots Hakon with an arrow. Lawan introduces Aiden to the centre and many of its key players, like Frank, the local drunk and ex-night runner, Ro, another PK who was pretty nice to be honest, and Jackmat, the character with the worst name I've ever seen in gaming. If Old Villador was an intro to show you what the rest of the game would entail, then it's pretty accurate, because once again Aiden is sidelined in his own story for other characters, specifically Lawan. With Hakon gone, for now. Lawan acts as Aiden's in with everyone, helping him get around and telling him who he should talk to. She's not a bad character by any means, but it's strange how she gets more character development than Aiden, who practically gets none until the very end of the game. Aiden feels like a passenger in his own story. Nearly everything he does builds towards Lawan becoming a better and more successful person. It feels like Aiden's choices aren't meant for him, but rather for her betterment. Aiden gets involved with the PKs once again, this time working with Jackmat and Hawan, the sex pest. Their mission is to take control of the old VNC tower in hopes that they can use the antenna to broadcast propaganda in order to scare away the Butcher and his renegades. Lawan and Frank start to panic once they realise Aiden is going up the tower for Jerkmate and Hawan, as the last people to try that were the Night Runners, who all pretty much died, save Frank and a few others. Lawan begs Aiden not to do it, but he's a badass so he just ignores her. He heads up there with Ro, MatPat and the rest of the red shirt PKs. Oh, I'm sure none of these guys are gonna die. These guys all die and Aiden gets stuck in the tower, and with no options left, he asks Lawan for help, who gets the resident alcoholic to try and bail Aiden out.
Frank? Wait! Where are you going?
He's as good as dead, Lawan. I'm sorry.
Thanks very much.
Luckily, Frank manages to guide Aiden further up the tower, and at the top you can decide who to give the radio to, Jackmat or Frank. I gave it to Frank because he's a nice lad who just wants to play music. The plot continues to revolve around Lawan when confronting Hakon in a church. Depending on your choices, Lawan can learn to forgive him, and even later into the game she becomes a Night Runner. It feels like Techland really wanted to make Lawan the main character of the game, and if they wanted to do that, they should have just done it, because Aiden doesn't have much going for him, which leads on to my next point. Aiden is boring. Techland made the right decision creating a plot that had more personal undertones. Crane was all about saving the world, and depending on Aiden's choices in game, he can save Villador from a crisis. My biggest issue with Aiden is the fact that he goes through little to no character development until the very end of the game. Every other main, good-natured character you come across sucks all the character development out of him. I'm not saying Crane is the most interesting protagonist in the world, but at least he goes from being an arse to a likeable guy. Aiden just stays fairly indifferent throughout Dying Light 2. His choices in the game don't really affect how people view him, besides from a few throwaway lines. He pretty much stays the same, but instead of growing as a character, he becomes a scary monster that rips people apart. This is probably the most disappointing aspect of Aiden overall. It's revealed that Waltz experimented on Aiden when he was a wee lad, and while Aiden was aware of this, he doesn't understand the extent of these experiments until he becomes infected by a volatile. Throughout the game, it's hinted that Aiden is changing. Though he retains his humanity for the most part, he possesses the strength and ferocity of a volatile. What makes it worse is that you are encouraged to pick up inhibitors, which Aiden injects into himself, that grant him longer immunity to darkness and increase his health. Though harmless at first, the more you use them, the more it becomes clear that they are changing Aiden. The game doesn't explore Aiden's powers apart from specific moments in the story, but Techland really missed an opportunity to integrate Aiden's transformation into the gameplay. Being able to turn into this beast-like creature should have been made into an upgrade, allowing Aiden to enter a frenzy. Not only would have this been a fun inclusion, it also would have made combat a lot more bearable, as it would be over much quicker. The game in general has a major character problem, especially with its villains. Despite how cliche Rice was, he was memorable and actually came across like an evil guy. Crane and Rice had many interactions together, allowing the player to get to know Rice on some level. We never get any of that in Dying Light 2. Characters describe Waltz as a really evil, sadistic guy, but he never comes across this way. It doesn't help that the voice actor makes him sound like a frail old man, despite being just as messed up as Aiden. I guess this kind of makes sense because, in a way, Waltz is just a frail old man. In the end, it's revealed that Mia is not Aiden's sister, but rather Waltz's daughter, and Aiden apparently knew this the whole time, but repressed the memories. A twist like this would have been more impactful if we got to see more of Waltz throughout the story, but most of the time we just fight his band of renegades. Waltz isn't the only villain of Dying Light 2. Apart from the smaller villainous characters like the guy who poisons water and the Cray twins, it's also revealed that Jackoff is a nasty bloke. The signs are there throughout your time with him. Jack comes across as power hungry, like when he tells Aiden to give him control of the radio tower, and if you don't, he basically threatens you.
The people need this antenna more than you do.
What?
I guess this isn't too bad so far. A friendly threat every now and then isn't the worst thing in the world. Kind of takes a turn though when he tries to kill Frank to spark conflict between everyone else and the Butcher. Whoa, that guy sounds pretty cool. He must be a badass supervillain with that name. No, the Butcher is unfortunately a product of rewrites. Most of his relevance to the story was completely changed, and his only appearance in the game feels like it was just forced into the narrative because fans had gotten hyped by his appearance in the early trailers. Apparently he's the guy that ordered the dumping of chemicals on the city, turning the outskirts into neon green and pissy yellow wastelands, and yet much like Waltz, he just comes across like a normal old man. Dying Light 2 needed a great villain to make the story more interesting. The first game had two good examples of a sadistic villain and a villain with good intentions, and Dying Light 2 fails at every kind of villain. It's difficult enough to get immersed in the Dying Light 2 story as it is, with all of its terrible voice acting.
Mum left because she was tired of it all. She'd had enough.
Like I've said a million times already about the first game, the story isn't that great, but it's carried by the actors who actually sound like they gave a shit about their roles. You could feel the emotion behind almost every line. Even the side characters who didn't have much to do still felt like they mattered, but in 2, it's all just flat. Almost every character sounds bored, and it's made even worse by really bad writing. I know the actors are reading from a script, but certain line deliveries make it feel like the characters themselves are reading from a script. It's really distracting in a game that has such heavy narrative elements to it. It makes the skip cutscene icon look way too enticing. Another off-putting feature of Dying Light 2 is the way characters look. Not so much the physical appearance of the characters, though some of them do look a bit uncanny, but just the lifeless facial expressions most of them make. No matter what tone of voice they have, they stare at Aiden with the same blank expression. Well, I say stare, half the time they can't even keep eye contact with you. How am I supposed to stay engaged if the NPCs themselves can't even be bothered? Finishing up with the god tier story, you and Lawan go to stop Waltz from launching nukes on the city. Depending on your choices, Hakon can come too, if you chose to nurture him into being a good guy again. Aiden confronts Waltz on what happened to Mia, where it's revealed that Aiden was being a dunce the whole time, and that his sister / not sister is actually dying. Waltz believes the only way to cure her is by destroying the city. What? Basically, Techland couldn't come up with a good enough reason for there to be multiple endings, so they had to just cram that in there. Aiden, you must help me bomb the city or your sister will die. What? Aiden ultimately wants to save the city, and right before he gets the key from Mia, Waltz bottles it and destroys the key. Probably the only good bit of voice acting in the game. The only way to save the city now is to blow up the missiles manually, which Lawan takes up herself. Either you can let Lawan blow up the missiles, or you can go and rescue her. I chose to rescue her, which Lawan simps would argue is one of the worst endings. Large parts of the city get destroyed, and Aiden leaves Villador out of fear that he is turning into a monster. This bit always makes me laugh. Bro's smiling like he didn't just get the city bombed. The Gooners may be a little upset that Lawan doesn't come with Aiden in this ending. If you made all the right choices, then you get the goat instead. This feels like the best ending for me. Hakon was an OG from the very beginning, and yeah, he did get a little bit silly, but he feels like the only real friend Aiden has, which makes it all the more satisfying when you see them walk into the sunset.
To the ocean, kiddo!
Dying Light 2 really could have been something special, though I will say the experience wasn't the most unpleasant. It had the potential to be much more than it was, especially after how good the first Dying Light is. Almost every aspect of the game feels rushed or half-baked or, well, just shit. It tries to please multiple people at once, without really committing to anything, and to this day, aspects of it are still broken. The Beast is supposed to be releasing later this year, and hopefully it takes more after the first game than the second game. Techland thought they had to overcomplicate everything, from the story to the gameplay, but Dying Light fans just want a fun jumping game where you fight zombies. I didn't bother including the expansion in this video because I've already made a video on it, and I really don't want to play it again. I would rather spend a whole game with Ezgi than spend another minute with this fedora wearing dick.